This is our Fireside chat, which is entitled Startup Communities Meets Lead Upwards Startup Communities Fireside Chat. So a lot of startup and a lot of communities and leading, which is really exciting for us. I'm Megan Barber. I'm head of network for Foundry. Most of you, I think, who are on this know us, but Foundry is a venture capital firm where we're focused on investing in startups and venture funds. And we are a group that really cares about helping our founders and the startup ecosystem. So this talk is exciting because it's really about joining two books. So Brad Feld's book, Startup Communities, and Sarah E. Brown's book, Lead Upwards, that are aimed at helping startup leaders and their leaders build inclusive startup communities for joiners as well as entrepreneurs. So very relevant topic. Excited to have you both here. A couple of how this will go. So Brad and Sarah are going to be asking each other questions, which is awesome. And they're going to be talking about their respective books, focusing specifically on content around expanding impacts as a leader, measuring success, etc. If you have questions, we encourage you to use the Q&A button to ask questions, and then we'll be able to facilitate those. And we are recording this. So with that, Sarah and Brad, take it away.
Thank you so much, Megan. I want to start by saying thank you to the entire Foundry team, Megan and Shannon. Just so grateful to get to do this. And Brad, of course, this is a pinch me moment for me personally, a dream come true to get to talk about these ideas with you, Brad. So very excited and looking forward to the audience asking questions as well.
Well, Sarah, it's my pleasure. And it's having known you for a long time and hopefully been a little bit helpful to you on your journey. I think the book that you wrote is extremely important. There's, so many books written aimed at founders and CEOs. There are very few books aimed at people on teams that are working for startups. And so there's a lot of this, okay, I'm part of a team. I'm maybe a founding team, maybe an early team, maybe a scaling team. Great. I just read the CEO-oriented book, but that's not aimed at me. So you gave a voice with this book, I think, to many, many people that are critical to the success of companies that just, are often overlooked in not just the books, but the blog posts and sort of all the thinking.
Appreciate that. And yes, so much good topics to dig into here. And I wanted to start by saying, Startup Community Second Edition, Startup Community Way, you talk about the Boulder thesis and the evolution of it. And I'd love to maybe kick off with, how have you seen your original Boulder thesis evolve?
Yeah, I came up with the Boulder thesis in 2011, and there's a great short summary of it that Kauffman Foundation did called Startupville, which you can watch on YouTube. I think if you just type Kauffman Startupville, it'll be the first thing. And it's 4 minutes long. It's kind of one of those things where I looked at it and I'm like, they got it. The four principles, which became, I think, a lot of the underpinning of this creation or the democratization of entrepreneurship globally, like the idea that you can build startup communities anywhere. The four principles were the startup community needed to be led by entrepreneurs. And this was not conventional wisdom a decade ago, right? A decade ago, university, government, all that sort of was heavily involved in these entrepreneurial ecosystems. But sort of I said, no, it's all about the entrepreneurs. So put the entrepreneurs at the center. They have to be the leaders. Second is that you have to take a really long-term view, at least 20 years, constantly looking forward. The third is that you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage. And this was, again, over a decade ago. It was well before the sort of current discussion around equity in tech, whether it be gender equity, racial equity, or any other flavors of equitable activity, of which, still in tech in 2023, there's plenty of people still walking around saying it's a meritocracy. And I just want to, Amy cut my hair the other day as I walked out of the shower. So I have less hair than I used to, but normally I'd say I pull my hair out when somebody says it's a meritocracy. It's like, come on. So like this notion of really being inclusive of anyone who wants to engage in the startup community. And then the last is you have to have activities and events that engage people. When I think about 2023 versus 2010, 2011, when I started writing this book, and really going back to 2006, 2005, 2006, when I started thinking about it at the very beginning of us creating Techstars in Boulder, there's been a really powerful difference, which is again, decade ago, a lot of these ideas were still new, they were provocative, we sort of lived them in Boulder. There are lots of people who were new to them or were trying to understand them. It wasn't sort of pervasively wired into the fabric. Today, it's completely wired into the fabric of everything that's going on. A second thing, which I tried really hard to get away from at the beginning, and I kind of got it, but it was very perplexing to me. It's especially true for people outside of Boulder. But I ended up being an integral connecting point as a leader to everything. So, the number of people, when somebody would talk about something Boulder related, do you know Brad Feld, or you work with Brad Feld, or somebody that's from Colorado, an investor from out of Colorado, is Foundry, or is Brad investing in your company? Like, that was pervasive. And my view is there isn't a king, there isn't a president, there isn't a queen, there isn't a boss. Like, there isn't a hierarchy, it's a network. And the notion that hierarchy has somebody at the top was antithetical to me. Today, and it shows in the way the startup community works, I imagine there are many leaders today who I've never met, they've never met me, they may or may not know me. And that's an important part of it, which is that it's not oriented around or controlled by a person, a firm, a set of people. And people have different impacts, but we're all just part of this network, this community that's growing and evolving. And again, in 2023, that's been very powerful for me to sort of notice and reflect on. And then the last is, I know that when I used to show up at stuff, 15 years ago, it wasn't all the same cast of characters. You get new people in different things, but there were more insular groups. There were, like, it wasn't the in crowd and the out crowd, but it was kind of like the people that knew each other and then sort of the people on the periphery. And today it feels like that construct has really been mostly obliterated. There's always going to be the situation where people know each other better than others. That's human beings. But sort of this notion of being able to show up someplace and just feel welcome and feel engaged quickly, without judgment, without like, who are you and why are you here? I've really seen that play out.
Really appreciate that. And I want to give a shout out. I remember, I think it was around 2013, 2014, after Boulder Startup Week, I, came up to you, I didn't know you. And I said, hey, Brad, I think we should start an LGBTQ group in Boulder focused on startup inclusion around LGBTQ techie issues. And you said, great. And you made all these connections. And I think, then that group has spawned other groups and connects with NC Wit now. And I think I love this idea of the network. And I know in the startup community way, you talk about this idea of leaders and feeders. And I think you use like papayas and apples for people who struggle with that term. I really appreciated that. And I'm wondering, for startup leaders who aren't necessarily a founder, how do you think about them in terms of the leader-feeder relationship?
Yeah, so I came up with this language in the original book in 2012, the first Startup Communities book. And we adjusted it some in the new book because I hadn't realized, I had meant for it to be provocative, but I hadn't meant for it to be diminishing. So the way that I meant it was that they were different things. There was leaders and there were feeders. There were apples and there were papayas. And what happened was it created a hierarchy. There were leaders and there were feeders. And that wasn't the intention. Again, it was that they were just different. And the viewpoint of that difference, as I evolved my own thinking and learned from my mistakes in terms of how I put it out originally, was that the leaders had to be entrepreneurs. And in the context of those entrepreneurs as leaders, the view that I had was whenever someone who wasn't an entrepreneur was trying to drive and lead the startup community, it usually was an agenda that was linked to their organization. That's not bad, that's normal. All organizations have agendas. That's the way, that's the organization's supposed to have an agenda. But what it didn't do, it didn't sort of release this notion that, look, what you're really trying to do is drive the startup community. And by calling them feeders, the view was they engaged in, they were part of, they were in support of the startup community. Over time, I learned that, individual members of those feeder organizations often played leadership roles in the startup community. And so we gave them sort of much more of a voice in the second book. But that notion that the University of Colorado can't be the leader, or the state government, OEDIT, can't be the leader, or, at the time, SendGrid, Rally Software, whatever, can't be the leader. They can be, individuals can be leaders, but those organizations had to be feeders and participants. The apple and papaya thing came up randomly in sort of a peak of frustration one day for me, when I realized that, these things were being used hierarchically. And this was pre-book. This is, as I was talking about, I was just like, they're just different. Like, some people love apples, some people love papayas. They taste different. They're just different things. It didn't really work in that first book. And so I had to do a better job sort of leaving it out.
I love that. I personally am a papaya fan. Would be very curious to hear from the audience if you have a quick preference. But I also, something I talked about in my book, and I think about a lot from the Boulder ecosystem in particular, which is where I've grown my career, is people who switch roles. Like, maybe they'll be a CEO of a company, go through Techstars, potentially then become an employee of another company. And these fixed identities of I am a founder sometimes can feel limiting too. And so I think also thinking about how do people potentially play a role in that, 20 years from today, time horizon that may be different today, than 10 years from now. I'm curious how you think about that.
Yeah, look, I'm going to underscore why I think your book is so important. That's one of the challenges that happens, is that there starts to become judgment on what you are. Are you a founder? Are you a CEO? Or are you an early employee? Or are you a hired CEO? Or are you part of the senior executive team? Or are you new to your career and trying to work your way up and be engaged in what's going on? And if I go back to this notion of being inclusive of anyone who wants to engage, a lot of people interpreted that, again, in the first book, and I think we did a much better job in the second book, of that meaning inclusive only of people who were entrepreneurs, which almost by definition is not being inclusive. Right? Like, the idea is you want to cast a really wide net. You want people that want to participate in this thing, whatever their aspirations are, whatever their current roles are, whatever their age, whatever their experience, whatever their gender, whatever their sexual orientation, whatever their success and failures have been, wherever they came from, like on and on and on. Like, you just want inclusiveness. And what I didn't work hard at, because I was so focused on founders with much of the writing I have done around entrepreneurship, at some point you have to sort of say, this is what I'm really paying attention to. There really have been two books that went further. Yours was one, and Jeff Busgang wrote a book, and I can't remember the name of his book, Startup Land or something like that. But where people sort of said tons of great stuff, but don't forget everybody else. And hey, everybody else, here's a way to participate and engage. And that's what you did. And, if I don't have another Startup Communities book in me, but if I had another Startup Communities book in me, I would definitely widen the aperture to include all of that.
I love that. I love Jeff Busking's work. Was really honored to get to interview him and feature him in the book. And I think he really did coin the term startup joiners. And I don't know if the Wiley team is on, but Brad Feld is the reason why my book exists, and was very honored and lucky to get to work with your editorial team at Wiley. So shout out to Bill and Purvi and a lot of the team there. But anyway, in thinking about the term startup joiners, I believe Jeff might have coined that. And I like this idea of people who join a company or join the ecosystem, they want to contribute, but not necessarily be the founder or CEO or have that sort of title. And it's interesting, maybe shifting gears. I was talking with Matt Blumberg before this, and he said, have fun with Brad, you will. And I think that's proven true so far from singing at the beginning of the webinar. But he talks about this concept of attunement from a CEO perspective. He's written wonderful books aimed at helping people think about CXO, founder of Bolster, and many other amazing endeavors in his resume. But this idea of attunement from the CEO perspective, I'm going to attune to my direct reports or my team. But I think about it a lot from attunement, from how do you attune to your manager or to whomever it is in the organization. And I'm curious to hear how you think about that as a VC. Like, how do you attune to your founders? How do they attune to you? Who gets attunement? Yeah.
Well, let me use a line that probably many people on this call have heard. Yeah, it's one that's become a Brad cliche, but it embodies how I think about my relationship to founders. And I think at Foundry, we try to use it as our frame, which is as long as I support the CEO, I work for her. My job is to do everything I can do to help that CEO be successful. Every CEO needs different stuff. This is where attunement comes in. I've worked with some ridiculous number of CEOs, over the last 30 years as an investor. And yeah, I mean, there's lots of overlap between what people want or what people need. But fundamentally, when you get to know the person, they need something different than everybody else. And so my job is to attune myself. It's a great word. Attune myself to that rather than try to comport them to me or conform them to me. Now, if I don't support the CEO at some point, I fall out of favor with, I decide that I'm not as confident in what she's doing. It's my job to do something about that. It doesn't mean fire her and replace her with somebody else. Like, first step is try to get to a place where I support her again. Attunement's important there too, because I have not found it over 30 years to be very effective to say, hey, Sarah, if you want to be successful, you need to do the following 4 things. Or, hey, Sarah, I think you're not being successful because you're not doing A, B, and C. It doesn't work. Like, that just ends up, downstream with lack of success. And so again, that I hadn't used that word before in this construct, but attuning myself to that person's strengths and weaknesses. Also, by the way, acknowledging my own weaknesses in the context of the interactions, because I make a lot of mistakes. And the way I am as an investor doesn't necessarily mean it's the right way to be. So it's working through that. And then, ultimately, if I can't get back to a place where I support the CEO as a board member, I generally have one tool available to me. It's the only decision I really ever want to make about a company, which is whether or not I support the CEO. Now, granted, I end up making other decisions about the company, but that's the one that I think has the most impact on the health or success of it. So in the same way that Matt talks about it as CEO to his team, I think it's very parallel to investor to CEO. Now, with that said, I don't think that's the norm across the investor landscape. So, I don't want to be Pollyannish. I don't want to be, fantasize about how things should or would be. It's just very personal. That's how I am and how I try to be. And there may be other, I'm not saying that other ways are worse or other ways are better, but in the context of what you described, I think that's the parallel.
I love that. Got a couple of questions from the audience. Maybe we can take one if you're up for it.
Yeah, go for it.
Question from Bill. Hi, Bill. It says, curious if you've seen those who start as joiners who have transcended to founders, namely living the life of a joiner, made them an even greater founder CEO. Would love an example.
Many, many, many times. And one of the things here that I think happens is that a pretty natural progression, there are multiple natural, I want to say natural is a good word, multiple natural progressions to become a founder, right? For me, I just started a company when I was in college. I didn't have a progression. I just started. That's a natural way to become a founder. You have founders who, are in senior roles in companies and then start companies. You have founders who have not really had a lot of jobs yet, relatively early in their career, and decide to found something, and on, lots of different paths. One of the things I think, though, and it goes both directions, that's really interesting is when a senior exec starts a company. So someone who's a joiner that works their way up and then decides to be a founder. The other is equally interesting, which is somebody who's been a founder or been a CEO who then decides to be part of an executive team versus being the CEO. And there's a fun person in my world to mention who I've known for 30 years maybe, who had this role, and it's somebody who works now for Bolster with Matt. And so I thought of her because of the linkage directly to Matt Blumberg, and it's Jenny Lott. And Jenny, I met Jenny in the 1990s when I was running my first company, and she was running her first company, which was a company called Ned Damon's Associates. And she was the CEO and co-founder, and it grew to be about a 100-person company. And at some point I invested in it and was an advisor. And then a company I co-founded called Interliant bought Ned Damon's, and she ended up being part of the executive team of that. So long history. At some point she sort of semi-retired from tech, stepped out, did some other stuff while she had her kids as teenagers. I think she was kind of burnt out from tech post-internet bubble as well. She opened a bookstore. She's a huge reader, like did some other things that were entrepreneurial, but not in tech. And then in 2010, I had invested in a company called MakerBot, which was growing incredibly fast. And Jenny sort of was starting to look for something new. And they, through my introduction, they hired her as, they didn't have titles at the time. They were 20 people. When they got bought, they were 2 years later, 400 or 500 people. And Jenny was essentially the number 2 person running most of the company. But it was a great example of something that's really powerful for CEOs to realize, is that some of the best execs you could have are ex-CEOs or ex-founders who no longer want to or decide they don't feel like being a founder again. So it works both directions, this movement from joiner to founder or founder to joiner. So I want to give both sides of that.
That's awesome. I think we have one more question from the audience, and feel free to type your questions if you have them. Drew is asking, what did you find most successful at changing the community dynamic from centered around Brad to more decentralized? And did you try anything that didn't work so well?
Yeah, well, let me start with what didn't work. What didn't work was me telling people that I wasn't at the center of it. So, when somebody would say something, I'd try to deflect. I'd say, no. And I'd give my startup community riff, and it's not about me. And I try that. And it just was ineffective. Like, it just kind of kept percolating around. There was a phase, it was probably for about a year, where I felt pretty embarrassed by it. And I didn't really know what to do about it, because I wasn't going to change my fundamental behavior. I was advocating for the Boulder startup community. I was a key part of it. It wasn't, I don't want to be part of this. It was like, I didn't really know, this doesn't feel good. I then started being very deliberate about exposure. So up to that, in general, I'm not deliberate about my exposure. I write a blog. Somebody said to me recently, I was with a friend of mine, David Cowan, who was in town. David's at Bessemer. He was in town for the Boulder International Film Festival, a movie that he did called Afghan Dreamers, which Amy and I helped fund, was in the festival. So we had dinner together after watching the movie. And if anybody's interested, it's Afghan Dreamers it's a movie about the Afghanistan's girls robotics team. And the story was awesome. And it's even, now it's real sad, but it's even more of an incredible story given what's happened in Afghanistan in the last 2 years since the US pulled out. All the girls, by the way, are out of Afghanistan with their families. They're all safe. It's another thing David spent a huge amount of time and energy doing, just making sure that they were all safe before we published the film. And, we were talking to some other people, and he made some comment like, about people and privacy and whatever. He says, yeah, and you got this guy, Brad, who just writes whatever shit he feels like on his blog about what's going on with himself in a loving way, right? Like, sort of laying it all out there. This links back to the starting point, which is I've just never been careful about that. I just kind of am how I am. I started being very deliberate about exposure. So, for example, anything that was Boulder related in terms of press, in-person things, anything that gave Boulder visibility, I started sending it to my partner, Seth. And he was very happy to do it. And he had plenty of his own inbound things, but I just sort of shifted it. So the lens wasn't when it was kind of Foundry, venture capital, it shifted away. Same thing with a bunch of local related sort of inbound. When people would show up in town for a long time, I would often get together with people. I used to host these random days. I stopped doing that. I said, I've done that. It's run its course. But I enlisted about a dozen people who I basically said, look, when somebody reaches into Boulder and wants to come here, learn about it, maybe move here, can I use you all as the connector points? And they all said yes. And I moved it around. So it wasn't that the same people every day got an email from me, but maybe once a week or, every other week. And they were awesome at then kind of being not a proxy for me, they were their own person, but being the ones that then had that happen. So that was another layer of it starting to work. And then if you know me well, I can function as an extrovert or in an extrovert world. I'm very comfortable, talking to a large group of people. I can do that, but I don't enjoy it. Like it's in the context of the best way to describe introvert, extrovert to people at some point was, if you're an introvert, interactions like that drain your tank. And if you're an extrovert, they fill your tank. So they drain my tank. At some point, I withdrew from a bunch of that activity. And that didn't create a void because there were lots of other people in Boulder who were very engaged in all that activity. And so I just wasn't as visible when I showed up. There weren't that, every now and then I do a thing like that, but I didn't make a big deal about doing a thing like that. I just showed up. And so that modulated it some. And then what happened pretty quickly was there were other people that started to become the attractor. If I summarize that, my efforts to try to tell people, no, intellectually, it's not me, it's everyone, that just didn't work. But when I changed my behavior to be less visible and to be less sort of omnipresent, that started to affect things. But I had to be persistent with that. And by the way, if my ego had needed to be fed continually with that kind of interaction, adulation, whatever, that wouldn't have happened the same way. It's another interesting lesson in some communities, startup communities, where, there is a person or a set of people that continue to have the sort of overhang in the community, whether it's, super successful or super wealthy or just noisy. So sort of modulating that and learning over time became important. By the way, just one last comment on that. I didn't change my behavior with regard to trying to be responsive to everyone. So, I still tried to respond to all my email. I still tried to connect people up. I still tried to be helpful whenever somebody reached out, but I just was much less willing and much less interested in engaging in all of the human interactions. Of course, then COVID happened, and that was in some ways very helpful for me on that arc. And, it allowed my natural hermit mode to really become front and center in my life as I sit in my room and live my life electronically. But by that point, by the time COVID came around, I think most of that had shifted and it wasn't centered around me anymore.
Nice. Taking a step back, I currently work for a global startup. We are represented by, I think, 24 companies based in Germany, entities in different places. And I think a lot now about the role of place in the startup community. And so outside of Boulder, maybe in 2023, you mentioned other startup communities in both startup communities and the startup community way. How do you think about the role of place given where we are now in 2023?
Yeah, it's a fun question. And it's a fun question because it incorporates so much individual bias into the answer. People who really want to get together with other people and really thrive off of that think that it's incredibly important to have people in offices, and it's incredibly important to have concentrated geographic activity. People who really don't want to be in offices or really don't want to be interacting with other people a lot, want to work and interact virtually, but not physically, are at the other end of the spectrum. And of course, the answer is very muddy, right? As a species, place matters a ton. It matters for all kinds of different things, positive and negative. I feel incredibly fortunate that I was born And by the way, it's place and time, right? I feel incredibly fortunate to have been born in the United States in the 1960s, right? I feel incredibly fortunate to have grown up in Dallas, Texas in the 1970s and 80s. And I feel fortunate to have lived in Boston for 12 years and had that experience, even though I didn't really love it. But unbelievably fortunate to be living in Colorado for the last 27, 28 years. Just, like compared to my grandfather on my mother's side grew up in Kiev, and he grew up in Kiev, think about Kiev now, but he grew up in Kiev in the early 1900s when Russia at the time was trying to exterminate all the Jews that lived in that part of basically everywhere. So, even then, like the sort of the dynamics of what happened over time, he was lucky he escaped, long journey across Europe as a teenager, ended up in Cuba, came to the US as an illegal immigrant, got thrown out of the US, came to the US again, this time, found his wife, got married, became a legal immigrant. Like just place, time, like those things are so important to our own existence. When I wrote Startup Communities, at the time, the cliche still existed that if you were serious about being an entrepreneur, you should just go to the Bay Area. And, there were serious people that said that over and over again. There were very successful Bay Area entrepreneurs that said that. Many, investors would say, look, I really like what you're doing, but if you want to get funding from us, you've got to move to the Bay Area. And I thought that was just nonsense. I thought that, not only is the history of the world that companies get created all over the place, like there's plenty of special things about the Bay Area, but there was nothing that caused it to be the only place you could do this. Pre-COVID, I feel like through a whole bunch of things, the Startup Communities activity, Techstars, a bunch of entrepreneurs, and then a bunch of leaders in cities all over the world, created hundreds of startup communities that were super vibrant, that were very, very place-based. And one of the things that I saw over and over again was they were not all the same. They had local culture, they had local norms, they had personalities that had to do with where they were. Every city has a reason to exist, and those reasons vary dramatically based on the natural resources of the cities. We talk about this a lot in Startup Community Way about place and how that lays to the resources that you actually have locally, not just the financial resources, but all the others: cultural, intellectual, educational, government structures, business structures. And when COVID happened, of course, it was take a snow globe and just shake it really hard, right? We went from this place where people were very locally focused in terms of their investing activity to where within a matter of 2 months, VCs who previously had never made an investment that they couldn't drive to were now investing in companies all over the country because it was all video. And then, of course, there was, great mobility of people. You had companies that started to go virtual or hybrid and all of this structure. Now shift to today. I think what we've got today comes back to where I started, which is the bias. Companies have individual bias, and that individual bias is driven by the founder, but it's a bias that can change. So I have a founder, a CEO of a company that I'm an investor in, Seattle-based, a good-sized company. And if you had asked that founder pre-COVID, could they be a virtual company? They would just laugh you out of the room. We have to be in the office every day. This is the only place we're going to have. We're going to build the company here. And that company today is fully distributed. I have another company that I'm an investor in, Seattle. Entrepreneur, very similar model. Everybody he hired was Seattle-based. They bought a company pre-COVID that included a big operations in Las Vegas and Philippines, started shifting people to other places. Today, his 250-person company, 10 people are in Seattle. A Boulder company that many people know, Sphero. For many years, when Paul Barbarian ran Sphero, Paul loved being in the office. Sphero was a very office-centric culture. It was a fun, exciting place to be. And that was Paul Berberian's bias. When Paul Berberian ultimately became chair, Paul Copioli, who lives in Dallas, is now the CEO. After COVID, when they were starting to think about what to do with the offices, they did an employee survey, and I think only 2 of the employees actually wanted to go into the office. And which was complete shock, right? Because it was the same people. It wasn't like a radically different set of people. So those biases get in the mix. If you tie it to startup communities, the same thing happens. Like you can build very powerful virtual communities and you can build very powerful relationships virtually. But there is a lot of value to place, especially for people that are biased to wanting to be physically together. And if you're being inclusive, making sure in your startup community that you make it available to people on both ends of the spectrum is really important. If I never want to come in person to something because I just don't like to be physically with other people, and there's no way for me to engage, that's not a very inclusive startup community. And vice versa, if I need to badly to get together with people and there's nothing to do with other people, not a very inclusive startup community. So you got to get the pieces right.
I really appreciate that perspective. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question from the audience, which is, hey, Brad and Sarah, question for you both. How do you see startup joiners leveraging their time at failed companies to pursue new roles in the startup community? I have found this difficult in the Boulder community that seems attached to success.
Sarah, I'll let you go first. I have some very specific things to this, but I'd love to hear it from your frame of reference too. I know I've been talking a lot.
I love it. So I have seen folks within the Boulder community work for companies that have shuttered, and I myself am included in that. So I'm biased, but I worked for a company that raised funding, sort of was in the news and had a Pearl Street office and shuttered, and I'm still here and I have a career that I'm excited about. So that's my individual story. That being said, I mean, I'm not going to speak for you, but something I appreciate is how you think about in the book, the network and the ecosystem being something that doesn't just reward success, rewards failure, and that the time horizon enables that. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts, but on a personal note, I'd also say, I think failure, like, what does that actually mean? And from the employee perspective, failure can look like failure in your individual role or failure of the company that you worked for. And so I'm also curious for the person asking the question, thinking about, oh, the company I worked for maybe didn't have the exit that I was hoping for versus, oh, I joined and I became a director of engineering and I whiffed and this was not the right role for me, or I had to look for another place. So I'm curious about the individual role failure versus the company.
I want to linger on that because I think that's profound. Companies fail much more than they succeed. A higher percentage of companies fail than succeed. And pick your statistical set, but there's 70%, 80% of startups fail or something like that. And many companies maybe have the modest illusion of success, but they weren't really successful companies based on how much money they raised and what the aspirations were. Most founders, I should say the other way, very, very few founders do one company in their career. There are a few. The vast majority of founders have multiple companies. And over a long career, you might have many companies, including plenty that didn't succeed or failed. And so the definition of failure in those cases also becomes important. I want to come back to that for a second. I'm going to use an example. The role failure is also really telling because there are important to sort of separate because there's lots of different ways to fail in a role. The failure that results in you getting fired from a job because you're not being effective is failure in a role. Another example, though, would be you find yourself doing something that you don't like. You're not enjoying it. You got promoted into a type of managerial role that was too far away from the work you like to do and you didn't enjoy it. Or you moved into a different part of the organization and took on responsibility for things. And you're like, this is not fun for me. This is not stimulating. I don't feel like I'm good at this. So, there could be failure where somebody else is determining it, also failure where you're determining it. And my own view is that they're all experiences to grow from. If you look at my history, my past is littered with so much failure, because I've tried many things, and some of those are things that the businesses failed, or they didn't go anywhere, or they didn't get liftoff, or it was a bad idea, or we had something that was working and then made some stupid strategic decision that caused it to go off the rails. Or it could be something where I found myself into it a couple of years and I'm like, why am I doing this? I'm not enjoying this. I don't feel like it's satisfying. I'm not good at this. Sometimes it's I try something that I thought I was really interested in, and then a year later I'm like, there's not something here. So there's so many different ways to label failure. And I'm going to come to my story for a second because I think it's really important. Some people who are Boulder based and they're old, they'll remember this name. It's Terry Gold. Terry had a company called Gold Systems that he started with a guy named Jim Fudge. The two of them founded it with no money, built a business, self-funded for many years, writing call center software, built on top of different call center hardware technology. Eventually, over a long period of time, they built the business up to about 100 people. It's a profitable business. They then raised some money. We were investors. They tried to scale the business up to the next level. That wasn't successful. They sort of retreated, and then a number of things over a period of time happened in terms of technology changes and business changes. And at the end of 17 years of running that company, there were no buyers for the company, and we ended up, and when I say we, Terry ended up just shutting it down, and shut it down gracefully, but it just decided this business has run its course. And we were having a conversation one day, and I said to him something about Gold Systems being a failure, and he stopped me. It caused me to really think hard about this whole notion. He said, Brad, Gold Systems wasn't a failure. It was a financial failure. Totally accept that. Like I didn't generate a return for my shareholders. I didn't, opportunity cost of my time in terms of what I did. Yeah, I had a good job and I got paid a salary, but I didn't create generational wealth. I'm fine, but there wasn't a financial success from that perspective. However, and I don't remember the exact metrics, but it's like, we serviced 50% of the Fortune 100. We had as clients, we had over the life of the company, 1,000 employees, 100 people met their significant other while working at Gold Systems. 10 people went off and started companies that, took the skills they learned from us. There were 50 babies that were born from people that were working at Gold Systems. And he just kept going. Like, he cared a lot about the people. And the thing is look, provided good employment for these group of people over this period of time. He was an important part of the early sort of 90s and 2000s of the Boulder startup community, and was a real fixture there. So defining failure is also important in the context of startup community, whether you're a founder or a joiner. And my own view is when people are too wrapped up in success, it's worth sort of stepping back and asking the provocative questions, because a lot of times the definition of success for someone at a point in time that's aspirational actually is not really what they aspire to or what they want. And then the last comment, we have been in a cycle with entrepreneurship that's been incredibly healthy. Values have been crazy. Prices went up like nuts. People made lots of money, or at least on paper made lots of money. Lots of things looked like they were working. Lots of things got funded. And, Thanksgiving of 2021 was probably the peak of this cycle. So 15 months ago, we've had a pretty aggressive decline since. Lots of people have lost their jobs. Lots of companies have gone out of business. Lots of other companies have had to retrench. Funding's gotten much, much harder. Public markets values in tech companies are way down. Cryptocurrency has been exposed for the fraud that it is. Whoops, did I say that? I thought that, but I'm not sure if it came out or not. And. So I think one of the things I would hope is that the startup communities are recognizing that and become more resilient against the backdrop and definition of failure, which, by the way, in 2011, 2012 was omnipresent, right? We're coming out of the financial crisis. Like the world was a disaster financially. And so, it wasn't that it was sort of on this crest of everything's awesome.
There's so much to unpack there. And if folks haven't read Brad Feld's recent blog posts about some films and sort of, things that are talking about different parts of the cycle. I know you've written about Madoff and you've written about, some of the crypto pieces there and taken nuanced views as well as more outright views. I'm curious, in terms of sort of this failure topic, how can someone successfully, whether a joiner or a founder, think about their next opportunity? And you've written a lot about how founders can think about when it's time to start a company or what's right for them, but sort of broadening the aperture or widening the aperture. If you were, let's say, going to look for your next startup job or opportunity, putting yourself in those shoes, how would you think about it? Would you ask certain questions maybe you wouldn't ask a couple of years ago or before that Thanksgiving? How do you think about that?
Yeah, look, I think transitions are really challenging at any stage of life, whether it's an age transition, a relation transition, a job transition. And what I've recognizing that a lot of people financially need a job quickly after they leave a job, or need to earn income after they've had a company they've been working on for a while that didn't work. So this is in the context of what resources are available to you. When you have resources available to you that will give you some time, it is usually very powerful to take a breath, right? To let a little time pass. It doesn't have to be a year, it doesn't have to be 6 months, but it might be a month, and just be super deliberate. I'm not going to think about anything for a month. If it's only 2 weeks, it's only 2 weeks. I'm not going to think about what's next. I'm going to let myself process what I just went through, what decisions I just made, what I just finished. And by the way, longer in a lot of cases is better. 3 months, 6 months, you had a trauma, whether you define it as a trauma or not, when you have a failure, whatever that failure is. And so giving yourself some time and space to reground yourself before you start thinking about what's next is critical. I think too many people feel, again, recognizing that some people need a paycheck in 2 weeks. So I'm acknowledging that. But if you're in a position where you don't, I think that a lot of people create artificial anxiety associated with, if I'm not doing anything, I'm not making progress, or that's bad, or somehow it'll be harder, versus I would encourage people to be brave about this idea of, I need some space. Maybe not a lot, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, but I need some space. And in that space, you allow yourself and your brain to sort of, again, process, absorb, whatever. The other thing I would say is, especially if you're an engaged part of a startup community already, the opportunities will fly at you when you lift your head back up. The only time that doesn't happen is when you're fundamentally did something that categorizes you as a bad actor. You're terminated because of sexual harassment. You do something fraudulent. You develop a reputation for being deceitful. There are things that would cause you to not sort of be embraced, but recognizing when you don't do those sorts of things, my own experience is the network you've built will help. It's important, though, that you don't expect the network to help, but instead you engage with the network. It's not that it's somebody else's responsibility to say, hey, Sarah, you just lost your job. Let me help you find a new thing. Or, hey, Sarah, I realize your company didn't work, but let me find you a new thing. It's the opposite, where, if you're an engaged part of the community, Sarah, you reach out to me. I'm like, great, tell me what went on. Tell me what's going on. Tell me what you're thinking about next. All right, I might not know something right now, but you've now planted in my mind this idea to make a connect for you, or to think of something. And oh, by the way, I might have some very specific things. Have you looked at this? Have you looked at that? I got a note. I just end with an example. I got a note from a young founder. She's in her mid-20s. I know her through her parents, who I'm very close with. I've known her since she was younger, before she was a young adult, but I haven't ever worked with her. I don't have, other than through her parents, have a social experience with her. She had a company that she'd started that ultimately she decided not to go forward with. After a couple of years of trying to build the company, she's wound it down. And she sent me a note saying, hey, I'm kind of poking around looking for a new thing. You got any ideas for me? And I said, I don't have immediate ideas, but here are a couple of places to go look. And I pointed her at a couple of things she didn't know existed, which were jobs at techstars.com and jobs at foundry.vc. And I said, look and see if there's anything that jumps out at you. And if anything jumps out at you and you want an intro to somebody, I'm happy to make the intro. And about 3 or 4 weeks later, I got an email from her that she'd taken a job at one of the companies that she found. She had never asked me for the intro. She just went and did it. Right. So it's that kind of thing. It doesn't have to be heavyweight, transformative, significant, but you just have to kind of go out and do that work.
I appreciate that. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions, or maybe one more question. We're almost at time.
I have a question for you, having written a bunch of books and now watched for me and now watched your writing. Talk about the experience of writing this book. I'm always curious how other people feel after they've done a book like this.
I love that. I think I had a conversation with Jeff Busyang, sort of right at the beginning of the project, and he said, you really don't want to work out what you're earning per hour on your time. Writing a book is such a labor of love. I mean, this is coming from him, who, similarly wonderful author as yourself. I think, it really was a labor of love for me, and being very vulnerable. I wrote it during sort of the peak of COVID. And I think after my first book, Power to the Startup People, which was focused on startup employees, and, having that conversation, I noticed there was a gap in terms of writing about startup leadership and what happens after you sort of start growing your startup career. How do you get to sort of the leadership rung if you're not the founder? And also, how do you think about being a leader, particularly folks from underrepresented groups where maybe not necessarily seeing people who look like them in those roles? And so during the height of the pandemic, I got to interview almost 50 people, asking them for their best practices, advice, people like yourself, people who are founded companies, but also people who've come up as startup leaders, and particularly folks from different backgrounds. And it felt really important to tell different stories, because I think there is no linear path as an employee for a startup career. You really have to forge your own. And so I found writing the book to be joyful, cathartic, difficult at times. I think the wonderful editorial team at Wiley made things as easy as possible. And certainly, being able to kind of organize my thoughts as they were coming together was very helpful personally. And I was in my first startup executive role when I wrote it, and I didn't know a lot of what I was asking about. A lot of it was, hey, how do I present at this board meeting? How do I speak at the altitude of the board? And then how do I also speak at the altitude of my team? And learning how to zoom in and out. That was really, I got to put it in practice. It was the book I wish I'd had. And now I get to share it with folks, and gotten feedback from founders as well, that it's helped them understand what their leaders are going through, because I think you can get into a mindset where maybe it's hard to have that empathy. Although I think great founders put themselves in other people's shoes.
Awesome. That makes me smile. It's another shared experience we now have, even though you worked on yours and I worked on mine. Now a lot of what you said is so true. It's such a challenge to write a book, but it does feel incredibly satisfying to have it. I think we're at the top of the hour pretty much, right?
Before I let you go, Brad, I have to ask, do you prefer eating apples or papayas? I realize I didn't get
I'm an apple person. I don't mind papayas, but I eat a lot of apples, and I like apples.
Okay, got it. Thank you so much. This has been a thrill. I could talk to you all day, and thank you to everyone for joining, and thank you, Shannon and Megan, for organizing it.
All right, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for those who joined and asked great questions. We'll see you at the next one. Thank you, Sarah and Brad. Have a great day.